So as we start now talking about the Cold War, we also want to talk about the main outcomes out of World War II that we also just didn't have time for in the final video. So some of the main outcomes. One of the major ones is obviously the massive amounts of loss of life. Okay, over 60 million dead, about more than half of them are civilians for two reasons. One is the fact that there are new unfortunate technologies and weapons that are being used that are a lot more accurate, a lot more deadly. So that includes tanks, artillery, the beginning of rockets as weapons, like the V-2 rocket that Hitler used against the British, in 1944 and 1945. Obviously, the nuclear bombs, firebombing cities was also a big part of that too. But then there's also the intentionally targeting of civilians in some regard for genocide and hatred. So think about the Holocaust, the civilian deaths exchanged pretty much between the Germans and the Soviets, because the Germans would essentially wipe out entire villages or punish them, rape them. And then the Russians would do the same as they got into Germany. There was also the things about trying to get for people to submit or to surrender. So that again includes the Battle of Britain, firebombing Germany, firebombing Tokyo, and then obviously targeting Hiroshima and Nagasaki with the atomic bombs. Trying to get countries to submit on their knees in order for them to essentially surrender. That's kind of the whole thing about the submission. And then the cowardice piece, looking at people who surrender as cowardly or to, just kind of show your own force. So that comes back to the rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, where while they had soldiers that they had to get from one area to the next, where the Japanese, after the Americans surrendered, but a lot of harsh treatment, a lot of civilian or not civilians, prisoners of war are killed on the march, underfed, starved, beaten, mistreated. Again, for that whole piece, and then also a destruction of entire cities like Rotterdam, where the Germans said, "Hey, if you don't surrender as a Dutch city, we're going to bomb the crap out of it. We're going to level it to the ground." And essentially, while the Dutch did surrender and met to the German terms, the Germans still destroyed the city anyway. So those are the things that helped to lead to the vast majority of deaths in World War II. While the battlefield casualties are really, really high, especially again the idea of fighting to the death in places like Berlin and Stalingrad, but also for the Japanese, also comes back down to these intentional targets of civilians. Okay, other things. So as we kind of mentioned in a few of the videos there, increased use of colonies for the war. Okay, in terms of material, money, soldiers, laborers, again, to work in factories, but also in the fields. Also more fighting in colonies. So again, tying back not necessarily to, so obviously within North Africa, with places like Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria, but also again into a little bit of Israel-Palestine and some fighting in that location, but also again French Indochina, Burma/Myanmar, the Philippines for sure. So again, other areas that had not really seen action in World War I, now seeing a lot of action in World War II. There's more women in the workforce and increased military combat service, particularly for the Russians fighting with actual weapons rather than unlike in the United States where they were again more support roles, even though they were certified and had official ranks and things of that nature. Again, it was like if women were pilots, they were flying cargo planes and supplies and the wounded, as opposed to the Russians where you found a lot of women with weapons dying and fighting alongside male soldiers or in guerrilla militia groups. Okay. Other outcomes, and we'll talk more about this one in terms of the Cold War as we go into Chapter 37. The creation of Israel and Palestine following the Holocaust, is following with the Balfour Declaration of a Jewish state, pushes for a lot of the Western countries to create a Jewish state following the death of 6 million Jews as a result of the Holocaust. But also tying into kind of a continuation here about the weakening of European power over colonies, that continues as a result of World War II, especially because the French pretty much lost all power and say in some regard to their colonies, whether that meant that the main French government was not in control or the puppet Vichy French, which served the Germans, was in control of places like Algeria. So this wishes for more increased nationalist and anti-colonial movements following, again, about, hey, we served you in the war, let's be rewarded for it, within that. Then we also, obviously, the main focus for now is going to be looking at the Cold War, so splitting Europe and the world between pretty much two areas, and then then you're either for the communists or you're for the West, or you're trying to be non-aligned in the middle. Between that, and then also a lesser extent between the U.S. and China, or the U.S. versus the Soviet Union and China, is China will break itself off from the Soviet Union in terms of their relationship. And then the creation of the United States, or not the United States, the United Nations and other supranational organizations to help regulate the economy, things for safety. So that again falls in with NATO but also for the economics for the EU, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, all right, to help sort of in that recovery piece. So that transitions ourselves over now to the Cold War piece. So in talking about the supranational organizations, let's talk first about the United Nations. Okay, designed to again fulfill the promises of the League of Nations by keeping world peace, in order of security, working together with the world superpowers and bringing everyone into this organization. But working beyond that too, in terms of food issues, about security, droughts, natural disasters, human rights, literacy, medical issues on a global scale, which they've been a lot more successful at than with the peacekeeping and security issue, because again, that's very testing. You also have world powers that don't agree with each other on the Leadership Council, okay, because which are limited in those roles because of differing national priorities and ideologies, especially the Soviet Union pretty much opposing, the United States, Great Britain, and France on a lot of different issues following the war right away, and then Communist China when they actually get a seat there later on. All right, so, and I don't know why it's like this, but whatever. So, talking about the actual Cold War, what kind of helped set up this understanding for why the ideology split? Well, conversations had been going on prior to the war's end. What do we do with Germany to avoid another World War III or the rise of another powerful German state? So taking into account the Treaty of Versailles and the reactions to that, along with the Great Depression, helps to understand the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the support systems that are put in place to prevent their economies from collapsing, but also the political scheme too. So the goal was to agree that all European countries could determine their own form of government through free and fair elections. So the split down here on the red, or in this map here in the bottom right corner, where you look at the red Soviet Union allied countries and the Western either democracies or again, somewhat democracies on the other side, fall under where the Soviets and the respective democratic states had liberation, where they liberated them from the Nazis. All right, and these were agreed upon prior to the war ending. So, and Yugoslavia gained independence on its own and became communist under Joseph Tito. So while the Soviets had agreed to it, they're also fearful of another war. They want to protect their homeland, and this would give them a buffer zone and give them allies, again, to protect themselves, reinvigorate, and help their states out or help their country out economically, so they could benefit within that. So that's kind of really the big reason, or one of the big reasons, because they also don't trust the West, thinking that this is going to be the next target. There is that still feeling of the Red Scare, of the Soviets taking over, so there's a lot of animosity that leads it to becoming a Cold War as opposed to a hot war where it's active and they're fighting each other. So they also agreed to divide both Germany and Berlin into 4 zones that will be controlled individually by the 4 main victor states in Europe: US, Great Britain, Soviet Union, and France. All right, so this would be the Soviet sector, British, French right along their border, and the United States. Okay, Soviets having essentially what we now know to be East Germany. And so the reason for why Germany becomes a separate state happens to follow along the way that we'll talk about here in the video. So Germany is meant to pay reparations with trade goods and products, but not in money. So different from what it was in World War I, because this would again ensure that the German economy is strong and is supplementing to those other states through finished products and trade goods, not money that they would need to help reinvest in their own economy. All right, so examples like sending industrial machinery, railroad cars, food, tractors to places that were damaged throughout the war. So this will help Western Germany, or what becomes West Germany, rebuild, as well as Western Europe. But the Soviet Union is not a fan. They want to punish them more, and there is a reason that East Germany and East Berlin do not rebuild in the same way that West Germany does, and West Berlin, because the Soviets wanted to punish the Germans as much as possible. So much so that, while West Germany and West Berlin rebuilt, and you don't really see too many of the scars in the war anymore, throughout much of the Cold War and right after, you would see the scars in the buildings as they were not allowed to be fully replenished or refurbished following the war, as a reminder. So the split, that mistrust between the two sides, leads to what we call the Iron Curtain, splitting between the democratic West and the communist East, which they also form into military alliances with NATO, okay, in the blue, and the Warsaw Pact in the red. But it's more than just that, too. because in the Warsaw Pact, they also form an economic group. So, Poland will focus on, let's say, building up grain, and they will feed the other states. Romania will focus on oil, and they will give oil to the other states, and there'll be kind of a trade-off based on specialties. All right. And anytime that, and they have to pretty much stay communist, and they have to trade with the other communist countries and have limited contact and trade with their other neighbors and the other parts of Europe. Any attempts at westernizing or liberalizing away from communism is met with strict resistance from the Soviet military, so much so that they, in fact, pretty much reinvaded Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia during Prague Spring in 1968. So met with a lot of repression throughout there. And again, these are just hitting a lot of the high points. And there are some videos in there too that obviously go into explaining some of this in a little more detail. So on the other side, what's going on in Western Europe? Why are the Soviets behaving this way? Well, part of that is also what the democracies are, the democratic states in the West. So President Truman, who takes over from FDR in the United States once FDR passes away before the war ends, comes up with this policy known as containment and the Truman Doctrine. So rather than openly fight a war against the Soviet Union, let's try and contain communism where it is, and then it will fall apart on its own. So this was kind of the U.S. policy that's going to get followed pretty much through 1991 when the Soviet Union then collapses, which helps to explain our actions against communist China, Vietnam, Korea, but also actions inside inside of North America, inside actions in the Middle East, to do that, to again prevent that communist expansion, because we fear a Red Scare about undermining U.S. interests and U.S. values, to in fact losing American democracy within that. So that's the whole point of containment. So the Truman Doctrine is an extension of that, the idea of supporting free peoples, resisting rebellions or outside forces that try to conquer them. So that includes using diplomatic means, using economic means, and military actions. Okay, so the domino theory is connected to this about if one country falls to communism, then the rest will, targeting predominantly Southeast Asia with Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And, you can kind of, when you see the maps and the information, make your own determinations on that. The economic part is the Marshall Plan. Okay, help those European countries rebuild so they do not become communist. So that way it will stabilize their economy and thus stabilize their politics and their social structures, so they will not become communist and will stay U.S. allies. All right. The opposite plan for the Soviets is the Molotov Plan, which integrates all those economies like we just said, with Poland feeding grain, Romania oil, okay, kind of the same thing. So examples within Greece and Turkey right away after the war, sending military aid and money to prevent communist rebels from taking over in each country and keeps them that way. And then we have some, quotes here to kind of explain that. So in terms of the money, you can kind of see here's the money in the millions, 13 billion following World War II by General Marshall, who was the chief of the army, who was kind of behind this idea. So in terms of that separation, though, within Germany, it was meant to be temporary, as was Berlin. But once the West German states come together, or the West German sectors come together, the Soviet Unions do not like that. And so they're already surrounding Berlin anyway, or the west part of Berlin, decide that they want to put pressure on it in order to make them surrender the city to the Soviets, because they fear that they're not going to get reparations back and that their trade will be cut off. And so the U.S. decides, instead of going to war and fighting over it, because the Soviets have control of the waterways into the city, they have control of the trains, the roads, let's fly them in. Let's fly in supplies. And they do this for about a year until the Soviet blockade ends. So that way, again, ships can come in, trucks can come in, trains can come in to do so. So as a result, we have West Germany, which is a democracy, West Berlin being a key part still inside of this completely communist area, and then East Germany as well. East Berlin, and again, as we still said, doesn't get up there. And so to prevent migration into West Germany via West Berlin, they then put up a wall in the late 1950s, early 1960s to prevent them. And that is a remnant of the Cold War that still sort of exists a little bit today. A little bit of the wall still remains, but will remain throughout the rest of the Cold War itself, again, as a symbol of that division. So in the next video, we'll talk about Japan, China, brinkmanship, and some of those early actions through the Cold War itself. So hopefully that's a good introduction following World War II in terms of the early actions and divisions between the Soviet East and the Democratic West.